Camilla Brooks had seen injustice before. As a legal aid attorney in Atlanta, she spent her days fighting for people the system had long since written off. Families cheated out of their homes, seniors drowning in legal jargon, working class folks crushed by corporate greed. She'd gone up against banks, landlords, and even corrupt bureaucrats, but she'd never expected to be the one sitting in a police station, her wrists raw from too tight handcuffs. The night had started like any other. Late shift, another eviction case to review, another landlord trying to cut corners and kick out tenants for a quick profit. Camilla had been driving home, windows down, the sticky Georgia air heavy with summer heat, when the flashing blue and red lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She knew the drill. Hands on the wheel, no sudden movements, calm voice. "License and registration," the officer had said, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Camilla complied, keeping her hands steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" A second cop appeared at her window, eyes scanning her like she was already guilty of something. "You're under arrest, ma'am." Her stomach clenched. "For what?" The officer's expression didn't change. "Fraud and conspiracy to commit mortgage theft." The words hit like a slap. "That's ridiculous. I'm a defense attorney. I fight against mortgage fraud." The cops didn't care. A minute later, she was standing on the side of the road, hands cuffed behind her back, while one officer rummaged through her car. She could feel passing drivers slowing down to watch. A black woman in business attire getting arrested? That was always worth a second look. Now, in the cold fluorescent light of the station, she sat across from a man who had spent the last decade making her job hell, District Attorney Daniel Hayward. Hayward was a career prosecutor, sharp-suited and polished, with the kind of smirk that made people want to punch him. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. Well, Camilla Brooks, didn't think I'd see you on this side of the law." Camilla kept her face blank. "Cut the dramatics, Hayward. We both know this is a setup." He raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "A setup? No, Camilla, this is justice. See, you've been quite the thorn in my side, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, making powerful people uncomfortable." He leaned forward, his smirk widening. "And powerful people don't like being uncomfortable." She met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "So you fabricate charges? That's your idea of justice?" He shrugged. "You got caught up in a bad deal. Turns out one of your clients was running a mortgage scam, forging signatures, flipping properties under fake names, and wouldn't you know it, your name popped up in the paperwork." Her heart pounded. "That's a lie." "Oh, I'm sure you believe that." He slid a file across the table. "See for yourself." Camilla hesitated before opening it. Inside were copies of legal documents, contracts, affidavits, all tied to a fraudulent real estate deal, and right there, clear as day, was her signature. Except it wasn't hers. She exhaled sharply. "This is a forgery." "Prove it," Hayward said, leaning back again. "Oh, wait, you can't, because all the evidence says otherwise." Camilla felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This wasn't just about stopping her. This was about ruining her. Hayward checked his watch. "It's late. I suggest you think carefully about how you want to handle this. You've got two choices. Either you take a plea deal, make this all go away quietly, or you fight it, and I bury you in legal hell for the next decade." Camilla stared at him. He was bluffing. He had to be. But then again, people like Hayward didn't make empty threats. She clenched her fists beneath the table. She wasn't going to let them take her down that easily. Not a chance. Camilla sat in the cold, windowless interrogation room, her hands resting flat on the steel table. The air smelled of old coffee and disinfectant, the kind of place meant to make people feel small, but she wasn't small. And she sure as hell wasn't about to be intimidated by Daniel Hayward. He sat across from her, radiating smug confidence, the kind that came with knowing the system was on his side. His expensive watch caught the fluorescent light as he lazily tapped his fingers against the table. "You're quiet, Camilla," he mused, tilting his head. "That's not like you." She took a slow breath, keeping her face neutral. "I'm thinking about taking the deal, about how deep this setup goes." She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Because this isn't just about me, is it?" Hayward's smirk twitched just for a second before he leaned back. "You think you're the first idealist who's tried to shake things up? The first one who thought they could expose corruption and walk away clean?" Camilla didn't blink. "I think someone is real nervous about what I might find." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're good, I'll give you that, but this time you're on the wrong side of the argument." He gestured to the file still sitting in front of her. "The evidence is airtight. Signatures, dates, money transfers, everything links back to you. The press will eat it up. A civil rights lawyer stealing homes from under poor black families? That's a headline." Camilla swallowed down the anger rising in her throat. They were smart. not just taking her down, but making her the villain. "Let me guess," she said, folding her arms. "If I take your deal, I get a slap on the wrist, maybe lose my law license, but no jail time. And in return, I disappear quietly." Hayward gave a small, satisfied nod. "And if I don't?" His smile widened. "Then I make sure you never see the inside of a courtroom again, except in an orange jumpsuit." The door suddenly creaked open, breaking the tension. A young officer stepped inside, his eyes darting between them. Sir, there's a lawyer outside, says she's here for Miss Brooks." Hayward's jaw tensed. "Who?" The officer hesitated. "Some lady named Valerie Carter." Camilla's eyebrows lifted. Valerie Carter? The Valerie Carter? The legendary defense attorney who had torn apart police departments, exposed corporate fraud, and made an entire career out of making men like Hayward sweat in court? She kept her expression neutral. But inside, something shifted. She wasn't alone in this fight. Hayward's smirk faltered for the first time. "Well," Camilla said, standing up, "looks like I have options after all." The heavy steel door swung open, and a sharp click of heels echoed through the interrogation room. The scent of expensive perfume cut through the usual staleness of police stations. Strong, confident, impossible to ignore. The woman who stepped inside wasn't rushed, wasn't flustered. She moved like she owned the place. Hayward barely masked his irritation as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Well, well, Valerie Carter, to what do we owe the honor?" She set her leather briefcase on the table, ignoring the pleasantries. "You're charging my client with fraud and conspiracy. I'd like to see the evidence." Camilla's heart kicked up a notch. Client? They hadn't spoken in years. The last time they'd been in the same room, Valerie was arguing a Supreme Court case while Camilla was still in law school, watching from the gallery. They weren't friends, barely even acquaintances. And yet here she was. Hayward smirked. "You must be slipping, Carter. This case is a disaster waiting to happen. Why tie yourself to it?" Valerie slid into the chair beside Camilla, finally acknowledging her with a brief glance. "Because I don't like sloppy work, and from what I've seen, this case is sloppy." Camilla suppressed a grin. Hayward's smirk faltered just slightly. Valerie opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file, flipping through a few pages before looking up. "Now let's talk about these so-called ironclad documents, the ones tying Miss Brooks to this mortgage scam." She made air quotes around the last two words. "Because from what I can tell, there are inconsistencies in the signatures and at least one notary stamp that doesn't match the official records." Hayward's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed even. "Forgery claims are weak. Even if one signature's a little off, the transaction itself is legitimate." Valerie tilted her head, amused. "Cute. But here's the thing, Hayward. You built this whole case on a foundation of bad paperwork. If we pull one brick, the whole damn thing crumbles, and I don't think you want that, not with an election coming up." Silence hung between them for a beat. Camilla could see the calculation in Hayward's eyes, the way his fingers tapped against the table. He wasn't used to being cornered this quickly. Finally, he exhaled, forcing a smile. "Fine. I'll send over the full file for review." Valerie gave a slow nod. "Good. Because if I find even one more inconsistency, we won't just be talking about a wrongful arrest, we'll be talking about prosecutorial misconduct." Hayward's smile thinned. "Be careful, Carter. You're sticking your neck out for someone who isn't worth it." Camilla felt her fists clench beneath the table. But Valerie didn't flinch. She just closed her briefcase and stood. "See? That's where you're wrong," she said smoothly. "Because this case, it's just getting started." And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving nothing but the scent of expensive perfume and the promise of a fight Hayward clearly hadn't been prepared for. The days that followed felt like a blur. The weight of the charges hung over Camilla's head like a dark cloud, suffocating her every thought. The press had already picked up on her arrest, and the headlines weren't kind. "Civil rights lawyer arrested for mortgage fraud." It was everything she had worked against in her career, everything she had stood for, flipped on its head. And yet, the real battle had only just begun. Valerie Carter had promised to help, and true to her word, she didn't waste any time. After Hayward's smug dismissal in the interrogation room, Valerie's team worked tirelessly to tear apart the case. They'd uncovered more flaws in the documentation, more forged signatures, and discrepancies in the records that didn't add up. What had looked like a solid case against Camilla was now starting to look like a series of expensive mistakes, ones that someone had intentionally made to cover up something much bigger. Still, the pressure was relentless. The media wouldn't let go. Camilla's phone rang constantly, mostly from reporters asking for statements. Some of her old colleagues reached out, offering support, but many stayed silent, unwilling to risk their own reputations. It was like watching everything she'd worked for slowly slip through her fingers. And yet Camilla wasn't ready to fold. Not yet. It was late one night when she found something. She had been sifting through the pile of documents that Valerie had sent over, wading through mountains of legal jargon and stale paper, when something caught her eye. A name. It wasn't a name that had appeared in any of the initial case files, but it was one that, oddly enough, appeared across several of the documents. A name that didn't make sense at first. Garrett Monroe. She knew that name. Garrett Monroe was a real estate mogul who had recently made a lot of waves in Atlanta. He had connections all over the city. Big money, big influence. He was known for his ability to make problems disappear, and his connections to a handful of local politicians made him untouchable. Camilla had heard whispers about his involvement in questionable deals, but it had always been brushed off as rumors until now. Her hands trembled as she flipped through more pages, pulling out document after document where Monroe's name appeared, each time in a different context. He wasn't just involved in the fraudulent real estate deals, he was the one pulling the strings. Camilla felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. She quickly called Valerie, her voice shaking with urgency. "Valerie, I think I found the link. It's Monroe. He's behind this whole thing. Every damn signature, every document. It's connected to him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Valerie's voice, low but steady, came through. "Are you sure?" "Positive. He's the one who's been laundering the properties, flipping them under fake names, using people like me as cover." Valerie didn't hesitate. "We need to move fast. Monroe is dangerous. He has too much power. But if he's the one behind this, it's bigger than just you. This could bring the whole operation down." Camilla nodded, her mind racing. This was it. This was the moment she could turn the tide. But she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Monroe wasn't going to let this go without a fight. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Camilla?" It was her younger brother, Mike. He'd come by to check on her, as he had every day since the arrest. He stepped inside, his face weary but full of concern. "How's it going?" he asked, sitting beside her at the kitchen table. She didn't know how to explain the mess she was in, the mess she had to get out of, but she owed him the truth. "Mike, I need to ask you a favor. I need you to help me find out everything you can about Garrett Monroe. I know it's risky, but if I can tie him to these properties, it's game over for Hayward and the whole team." Mike frowned. "You sure about this? Monroe's dangerous. He's got people everywhere." "I don't care," she said, her voice steady for the first time in days. "I'm going after him, and I need your help." Mike nodded. "You've always been the one who fought for other people. I'll help however I can." Camilla felt a rush of gratitude for her brother. He was the only one in her family who truly understood her, who believed in her when things got tough. The next morning, Camilla and Valerie met in the same dingy cafe they'd been using for their strategy sessions. Valerie was already there when Camilla arrived, sipping coffee, her eyes scanning the room like she was waiting for someone to make a move. "You're sure about Monroe?" Valerie asked as Camilla sat down, laying the stack of papers on the table. "I'm sure, but we need to move fast. I don't think Hayward knows what we've got on him yet," Valerie smiled. "Then let's give him a little surprise." The next few days were a blur of late-night research, phone calls, and meetings with contacts who had information that could crack the case wide open. Every time they uncovered something new, the case against Camilla grew weaker and weaker, while the web of corruption surrounding Monroe grew clearer. By the time they were ready to take their findings to the press, Camilla had one last conversation with her brother. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You've been through hell and you're still standing." "I've got more to fight for now," she said, looking at the stack of files in front of her. "And I'm not backing down." The next day, the news broke. The headlines weren't about Camilla's arrest anymore. Instead, they read, "Real estate mogul Garrett Monroe linked to nationwide mortgage fraud scheme." And just like that, everything changed. The morning after the news broke, everything changed. Camilla's phone buzzed nonstop with calls from reporters, old colleagues, even a few unknown numbers. The media had finally picked up on the real story. Garrett Monroe, the man pulling the strings in the fraud scheme. And suddenly she wasn't the villain anymore. The tides had turned, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The next day, Hayward's office called. He wanted a meeting. Camilla didn't trust him, but she knew it was time to face him head on. When she arrived, he was sitting behind his desk, a forced calm in his eyes. "You've made quite a mess, Brooks," he said, flipping through a folder of papers. "But you didn't think this was over, did you?" "No, I didn't," she replied, standing her ground. "But you're done here, Hayward. Monroe's not getting away with this." He sneered. "You think you've won? Monroe's too powerful. He owns half this city." Camilla stepped forward. "Not anymore. You're both going down and there's nothing you can do to stop it." For the first time, Hayward seemed unsure. He looked at the file in front of him, then at her and finally sighed. "You'll regret this." She nodded, feeling the weight of it all. "Maybe, but at least I'll regret it for the right reasons." The final blow came the next day when the authorities announced their investigation into Monroe, thanks to Camilla's hard work and Valerie's connections. The case against Hayward began to unravel as his ties to the fraud became clearer. As she walked out of the courthouse, Camilla felt something she hadn't felt in months: relief. The fight wasn't over, but for now the system had been forced to listen. And that was a victory. She smiled, knowing that no matter how deep the corruption ran, there would always be someone like her willing to take it on, no matter the cost.